Hey, Peter, thanks for being here.
Well, thank you, Stefan. I'm delighted to be with you. I always enjoy our time together and our conversations, and thanks for inviting me into this conversation. I've been working with York in the Toronto area since 2020 is when we launched this program. It's the first ever certificate program in information privacy that York has offered. So it was a sort of a new investment for them. And I was introduced to them through a mutual colleague who was a cybersecurity professional who was also providing some input to them. This was in the early days when they were just figuring out what is the program, what should it be, who else is doing this, what kinds of approaches could we take. And this colleague of mine was like, "Oh, you got to talk to Peter," because back in 2006, when I was working for what is today still the largest professional association in the field, which is the International Association of Privacy Professionals, the IAPP, an American organization but with global presence. When they decided to create a professional body of knowledge and testing standards and really a certification, a professional credential for the field, that's when I became involved in the Canadian marketplace. The first, basically what I did is I helped to launch the CIPP, which is the Certified Information Privacy Professional. That's a professional certification. It's different, comes from a professional body, but it was the first, and still is, it's the first and largest professional designation in the field of privacy. And when it came time to create the first designation that wasn't strictly focused on America, Canada was the frontier. And a variety of numbers why. It's an easy trip north from the States. The executive director at the time, now the CEO, is Canadian, Trevor Hughes. He's a Peterborough, Ontario native. And so I was sent to Canada to start to build that. And in 2006, I was meeting with who were at the time the leaders in the field in Canada, major chief privacy officers at the major telecoms, banks, retailers. And we started to determine, what does Canadian privacy mean? What's in it? What should practitioners know at a general level? And where is it headed? What should the standards be? So we launched the CIPP-C, or CIPP Canada, in 2006. That also led to the first event in Canada, which was the IPP Canada Privacy Symposium, which is still held every May in Toronto, and a chapter, IPP Canada, based in Ottawa. All of that happened in 2006. That was my entree to Canada as a country, which I fell in love with, and now I'm proud to say I'm living and working here. And also the beginning of a long journey where I came to know the issue in Canada, but also the issue internationally, because I was still working for an international organization. So when I was introduced to York, it was in recognition of that work. They were like, well, here's a guy that did a certification in this. He must have something to say about what a university course should entail. So initially I was just advising it, but as we got further into it, it became apparent. They were like, well, would you like to create the content? And then it became, well, would you like to teach it? So that's where it ended up. And in the fall of 2020, after much development, we opened the course for the first time. And it's a hybrid course. It's 6 months in duration, 3 courses, one in fundamentals, one in technology, and one in operations. And a variety of people come to the class. It's they could be technologists, they could be records managers, they could be health professionals, government and industry all across Canada. But we also give exposure to what else is happening in the world, because this is a global issue everywhere. Proud to say I'm still the instructor of the course. It's a thrill. It's an issue I believe in passionately. And I actually, by the way, in closing, believe in it from a Canadian perspective, because I think there are things happening in Canada today with law reforms that are underway in Quebec, federally out of Ottawa, where Canada is looking at it in a very unique, pragmatic, collaborative way that I think is distinctly Canadian. It's not the way the Europeans look at the issue. It's not certainly the way the Americans look at it. And it's not just that. It's not just that it's authentically Canadian, but it's positioned in a way that might actually be the model for the future, because it balances considerations of fundamental rights of individuals, which it should, along with organizational obligations, but also with a view to what does this mean for Canadian society, for Canadian economy, for trade relations with other countries, with technology innovation. And all of these aspects need to be considered, because if you don't look at it that way, you'll end up either having a wild frontier, which is tilted entirely to industry like the United States, or you'll end up with something that's extremely cumbersome, that's very rights focused, but arguably at the expense of innovation and economic growth, which is Europe. So that's why Canada is pragmatically positioned in the middle. At least that's the potential, because this is not concluded yet. This is an ongoing process. The fundamental question will be, and I'll end it here, will Canada stay Canadian, or will it veer more to the European model?
I come from a background of primarily software engineering, and then they eventually went to do an MBA and so on. And I can just imagine the difference between 2006 when you started versus what's going on right now with GDPR that came up and is now kind of taking all the room. Sometimes I feel like marketers will tend to want to put it under the rug and dismiss it. It's like, no. Okay, well, I don't want to worry about privacy, and I don't want. I know there's a law, and I need to do this and that, but I don't. I have to do it, but I don't really want to do it. Do you have any kind of recommendation of advice for would-be managers or marketers?
Absolutely. And thank you, Stefan. It's a great question. And to let the audience know, I am a former marketer. So this is the world that I come from, as does Stefan. So, I mentioned my work with the IPP, but I didn't mention that before that, I was in the advertising agency business. And I was here when for the birth of the digital advertising arena, which is an area that Stefan and I have had many spirited discussions about, because as many opportunities and innovations as there have been in that arena, there have also been a lot of controversies. And when it comes to privacy, there's probably no more, acute a set of issues than marketing privacy issues. And that's because consumers are familiar with this. They may not all be invested in health privacy or financial privacy because they only interact with their doctor so often or their bank so often. But every day in their daily lives, they're getting messages, they're doing online searches for products, they're doing, they're getting offers and sweepstakes. They're interacting with companies regularly. And so they're very fluent in the marketing transaction. And thus, I think even more and more with each passing day, demanding more and expecting more in terms of responsible ethical practices from marketers. And marketing permeates everything. It's every industry, even government markets to a certain extent. So this is an area you must master from a privacy perspective. And to get to the core of your question, Stefan, I recognize it because I have sensed that sentiment as well. Like, why does this matter? Why should I be concerned about it? Isn't this expensive? It's a real risk and liability orientation. And I get it because this is actually where privacy started, which is, what does the law say? Tell me what I got to do to stay out of trouble, but let's keep it at that. You're basically an expense area in privacy. You're all about potential risks and liabilities. Those scare me. I want to give you the resources you need to keep those under control. But but that's not sort of the profit-minded side of the house. Like, there's a whole bunch of stuff I want to do with data over here, and I don't want you messing with that because I don't want you to tell me not to do it. Where the profession is pivoting, however, I think, and this is happening at all levels, and it's being driven by a number of things. One is digital transformation. You've heard a lot about this, where companies are being, urged by stakeholders of all varieties, board directors, investors, partners. You got to be doing more with the data. What are you doing to become more digital? So they're getting that pressure. There's also, frankly, coming out of pandemic, I think a greater consciousness about what is my social role? What are my relations to my employees, to the communities I serve? What's my geographic footprint? What's my climate impact? That's ESG, environmental, social governance, or as it was once known, corporate social responsibility. That's this broader sort of ethical sentiment, like, what am I to the public? What does my brand mean? And that's the core of marketing. And all of these attributes are feeding it into it a way where they're looking and they're starting to frame data that way. So as I mentioned, data transformation, where's the value? What is my responsibility? Data is now part of that too. So it's not just keep me out of trouble. It's, what am I doing in a proactive way with data that is beneficial, that is serving a data for social good, a social benefit? And that's a different orientation. Suddenly, privacy is not just a risk or a concern. It's an attribute. It's a brand value. It's a positive. It's a profit center. Can you imagine? Mm-hmm. Has anyone heard like privacy being discussed as a profit center? They're very nervous to say that because they don't want to say like, I'm pimping off data, excuse the phrase. But that's really what this means. And privacy professionals are now being called upon to not just talk about risks, but to talk about opportunities. So the conversations are now, what can we do with this data in a proactive way that builds value for our stakeholders? Because that's our fiduciary responsibility as an organization. As marketers, that's what we have to do. We can't sit on this. Data at rest has no value. It must be in motion. I want that friction. I want that collection and processing. That's where the value is. But how do I do that within reasonable boundaries? And who can advise me on that? Because I may be a legal professional or I may be a marketing person with some sense of what's right and wrong, but I don't in fact know all the particulars. And that's where the privacy professional comes in. Or the marketing pro who just wants to be smarter on privacy. And I've had several of those in my class as well. I love that because the more intelligence you can work into what you're doing in a marketing way, it's all the better.
There's something going on because there's a lot of innovations. There's a lot of startups in privacy tech. And at the IAPP conference in Toronto, when I was there, I heard something that made me got a smile on my face because over the past several years going to marketing conference, what I heard was marketers are going to spend more on technology than the IT department. Guess what I heard at the IAPP? I heard the legal department is going to spend more on technology than the IT department. So the same spirit of saying, okay, this is getting too complex. We need to have tools, automation, things that will make our job easier because it is a complex environment. But the positive side of that is innovation, like you mentioned. There's a lot of opportunities for startups, for innovation within the company themselves so that they have better processes in place, that they have better governance, that they have better tools and so on. So I think there's a huge opportunity in that area also to create the future of privacy from a marketing perspective, yes, but for touching on all other aspects of the business also.
I agree with you. That's a keen observation, Stefan. And as you and I both know, and maybe some of our audience here as well, MarTech, marketing technology, has been around for a while, but not so much from a privacy enabling standpoint. It does a lot of interesting things with audience segmentation and campaign analysis or different sorts of transactional details, consumer behaviors and understandings. But the privacy tech universe you referred to is blossoming, and we've seen a notable increase in the interest for it, in the number of companies in the space. The IPP, which you mentioned, publishes an annual guide, actually, that lists all
which is getting bigger and bigger.
Exactly. It started out at like maybe 25, and I would see this on the floor, as you did, at IPP events. Now it's well over 175 companies all around the world doing this work. And what is the work? Well, the work is things like data inventory or data flow analysis or doing a privacy impact assessment or doing a data subject access request, which is when individuals ask to see the records you have on them, which, by the way, they're entitled to under law pretty much everywhere on the planet, including Canada. What's your system for that? Do you just have a person by the phone? Like, that's not going to last very long when you have 10 million customers, right? So you got to automate that. And there's all sorts of other things too, where these are technologies, vendor technologies, that are coming in and automating a lot of this for you. And as marketing pros, you should feel reassured by that. Like, whew, because that would overwhelm me, right? Now I can work, if you fairly evaluate the vendor and they're good and they're solid, because you have to do a privacy impact assessment on them. That is an encouraging development that points to the importance of the issue, more investment on the parts of companies and in the marketing and legal areas, as you note, Stefan.
I really like the point that you made that privacy shouldn't be perceived as an expense anymore. And we need to be creative and innovative and turn it into a benefit for the company, turn it into a brand value for the company. Any parting thoughts for the students?
No, thank you. I love to close on that, to give you kind of, pivot forward and tell you how I see what's happening, like where we're going with this. Just 2 points. First, I want to leave you with 3 key points, which is trust, safety, and identity. Trust is actually what privacy is. So, privacy is a loaded term. It has a very personal context for a lot of people. I may feel a bit different than Stefan does than some people in this room right now. And that's good. It's meant to be personal. But what coalesces it all is at the end of the day, from a marketing perspective, certainly from a brand perspective, it's about trust. If you get privacy right, you will find few things in the world that will enhance that sense of trust, that investment that customers will have with you, and the longevity of that investment. They'll be with you forever if you get data privacy right. But the inverse is awful. If you get it wrong, you may never see that customer again. So you can choose how you want to look at it, like optimistically, like I'm going to do this great, nothing's ever going to happen, or I get this wrong and we lose big. You can figure out what strategy works best for your organization, instilling fear or creating optimism or both. Safety is how the issue is being framed more and more in legislative forums. Europe is starting to do this more than anyone, but it's happening in Canada too, which is, it's not just about harms that are resulting from data, but what is the sort of the safe environment we're trying to create, most especially for dare I say, the marginalized or the disenfranchised. So children, the elderly, the disabled, people of color, indigenous tribes, just to mention a few examples that I think are very appropriate for Canada. What are we doing to create safer environments where they can access services, where their voices are represented, and yes, where their data is protected? But privacy is kind of elevating up beyond its own little narrow level into that broader discussion of safety. Think about that. And then remember that identity is how individuals look at this. We can look at pieces of data all day long, and in marketing we do, but really those are little, that's sort of a diffuse environment that's very scattered and fragmented, which in theory, each piece combined forms a picture of a person. But the individuals just really looks at it all as being themselves, like that's me. So don't look at the data, look at me. Look at the fact that this is really about my identity and how that is controlled or how that is permissioned into this. And we may, and Stefan, you and I have talked about this, we may see a seismic shift, and zero-party data is part of that, where we're seeing it move away from sort of governments, advocates, or companies making decisions for us, where we're going to be more empowered as individuals. We'll make the decision, thank you very much, about how this identity data is used. You have to come to us first. You don't have it already, you come here. And I think that's where that's moving. And lastly, as a point, is just recognize that, and this goes back to the original discussion around moving from risk and liabilities to value and benefit and opportunity, is the fact that despite what you're hearing and despite what you read about every day and what you see on television, this is going to move away more from laws and regulations than you think. Law and regulations are important. Yes, they need to be tougher. There need to be strict penalties and sanctions. There needs to be order-making powers for the commissioners. They'll love to hear that, hearing me say that. But that's just a foundation. The question is, what more are you doing? Laws and regulations alone are not going to get us to a better place for privacy. So remember, to me, at least, there's a big difference between compliance and privacy protection. These are kind of starting to separate, because you can be compliant with law and still have some pretty serious privacy issues. You can, because law necessarily is fixed in time, and it does not adapt in real time. And with more and more issues being driven by technology, which does move and is very adaptive and is fast and always forward oriented, how are you going to do that? How are you going to take something like the Magna Carta and try to catch up to something that's like a laser powered rocket? It's not going to happen. So you'll need this, you'll need the legal compliance, start there, but then you'll have to think about things like ethics and practice principles and codes of conduct and self-regulatory frameworks, and perhaps most importantly, technology tools, things like privacy engineering, privacy by design, which is a Canadian concept, building the privacy into the feature of the product. Privacy is a feature. Can you imagine? Just like turning it on or getting a window, like privacy is a feature. So that's where it's going to migrate. And the companies that get that, and particularly marketing pros that understand, I've got to know more about technology, I've got to know more about ethics, because that's what the world is going to demand. Consumers are going to get way ahead of the laws because the laws just cannot catch up.
Legal compliance doesn't give you any competitive edge. It's a requirement. You have to do it.
Exactly right. I don't want to suggest, just hear me clearly, please. I'm not suggesting, skirting the law, breaking the law, nothing like that.
No, that's a minimum.
Absolutely. That's a minimum threshold. Know your obligations under law and observe those. I do respect that every organization has a different risk profile. So there's some people out there, there's some edgier marketers in the room. They're going to want to push the envelope. I get it. I've been there. I've been one of those people. I get it. So you know that there's a certain internal culture that you have, and you may not necessarily be able to change that, but you just need to navigate through that very smartly. Know what your risks are, know the risks you're taking, and be prepared for that.
Yeah. Well, Peter, that was absolutely great. I'm sure that everyone is going to love to hear about what you had to say. And thank you so much for being available to do that.
My pleasure, Stefan. Great to meet everyone in the class virtually, and always good to spend time with you. Thanks for the conversation.